We're gonna get started. You know that we always start on time here because I'm neurotic and because we don't have much time after all. So I'm really glad to see you tonight on this horribly cold and windy, and I don't know if it's rainy or red or snowy day, but you're all here, and that's always fantastic. My name is Paola Antonelli, and I am a curator here at MoMA, and I'm also the director of R&D. As I say all the time, we do a lot of R and very little D, but the R is good, and the R really concerns what's happening in the world. We want to try and show to people that museums can be the R&D of society, and especially this brand new museum that I hope you've already visited, not only in its ground floor, but also in the collections. That makes me super proud of what we have accomplished. This is a little plug for the new MoMA. Yes, let's just give a round of applause. Now, also to my colleagues that have done a wonderful job. But back to MoMA R&D. We established this department a few years ago, really with this desire. We don't want people to think that they can come to a museum just to see art, however important that is, or just to experience performances, but also to think about life and also the complex issues in life. And for those of you that are regulars, you know we've talked about aging, we've talked about death, other really lighthearted subjects, and we tackled a lot of difficult issues. And today, maybe we're going to tackle one of the hardest of all, which is anger. It is not only hard, it's also in our face every single day. We are so close to it that we don't have any way to really evaluate where we stand anymore. And that's why I thought it would be important tonight to discuss it. And as usual with these salons, we have great speakers that come at it from different angles, a few video contributions, and then there's you. And I know that you've read the whole reading list during the weekend, as I have, yeah, of course, and that you are really prepared. No, without any jokes, we all have our connection with anger, and I hope that the reading list helped you clarify what you want to discuss tonight. So, of course, you all know our good old Howard Beale. How current, how timely is Howard Beale? I mean, I'm not the first one to talk about it, but the truth is, it really feels as if it were yesterday, and instead it was 1976, when Americans in a fiction movie network, Sidney Lumet, 1976, found a person that could crystallize everybody's anger and scream and really make it all happen, not only on TV, but in the streets. And some of the great quotes from that movie are here, but that is particularly interesting. Mark Schumacher, I love it. Suicides, assassinations, mad bombers, mafia, hitmen, automobile smash-up, the death hour. A great Sunday night show. So this idea that it would kick Disney out of the air. And of course, Howard Beale's slogan, I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore. There are so many different types of anger. Of course, the one that is in our face every day, besides our small personal ones, just a little parenthesis, I was rereading Roxane Gay's essay. And it was really funny because in another op-ed she talks, she wrote beautiful pieces that are about anger and who has the right to be angry. And she was talking about how she has road rage. And she was describing road rage. I have sidewalk rage. I start measuring people and I do bump with my shoulder into people. I'm really violent. So we have those little rages, and then we have the big angers that are usually political angers. And in an attempt to really be bipartisan, I was trying to show anger from both sides, even though the left side anger is kind of nicer here, but okay. It's really quite interesting to see all these different types of anger that, of course, are really fed also by what's going on at the White House. But you see here also Nancy Pelosi's recent spat with the journalist that accused her of hating Trump and how she talked about the fact she did not hate. And I was looking at also an essay by Audre Lorde where she makes a distinction between hatred and anger and how constructive one is and how instead destructive and annihilating the other is. So quite interesting. But all these different types of anger are so familiar to us every day that sometimes we're almost anesthetized to them, but hopefully not enough. Of course, political anger happens all over the world. People are angry at their governments in most nations, in many nations at least, from, of course, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Hong Kong, and Beirut. Beirut and Hong Kong are probably the most recent examples of people being angry at their government and really, with their anger, toppling in one case and in the other case resisting to without toppling yet, but we'll see what the future will bring. But it's really an anger that has been fueling serious protests and serious resistance, and tonight we'll hear also from some of the protagonists of those protests. In some other cases, the protest is not for the whole government, but for specific reasons, but it's not less angry. We had also a salon on protest, and sometimes there were overlaps in the preparation of this salon that Theonosia Raferas and Sam Ozer did. And we were really careful to show the types of protests that were fueled by anger and that became, in some cases, violent, but not always. So you see here from Amazon workers striking in Berlin to the taxi drivers protesting against Uber in France, and also what's happening right now in France, the pension strikes from last week. Not to mention also dignity marches in India against the sexual violence that is happening for women in India all the time, and of course the Me Too and Trump protests on the side of the women's. And of course these are just examples, but there are so many more that we could call. There are also much more organized or at least focused types of anger. Greta, of course, Thunberg has become almost the emblem of righteous anger, and she has deployed her anger to such performative effects as to become almost like a heroine of the movement. The moment where she really glared at Trump has remained in everybody's souls. And there are different types of anger that can be expressed in performative ways that have to do very often with the environmental movement. Because there's a connection also to the elders, to different tribes, to the land, to more symbolic and also spiritual possibilities and avenues, often the environmental protest, angry expression is amongst the most visual and the most memorable. We'll also hear from Extinction Rebellion tonight in a video contribution. There are historical examples of collective anger that remain really ingrained in our minds. They have happened all over the world. Down here in the middle at the bottom is Argentina. In 1982, it's the mothers of Plaza de Mayo. They went from 1977 to 1982 trying to demand to know something about all their children that had disappeared. But of course, we also have ACT UP and the whole AIDS resistance in the 1980s. We have other examples of more destructive violence and anger from the Crown Heights riots here in New York in 91 and the Los Angeles riots in 92 that I actually was in the city for. It was quite amazing. And underneath the rally that called for a peace between the Korean community and the African American community there. Not to mention cases like the Hutu-Tutsi genocide in Rwanda that was fueled by anger, and that anger was every day burning higher because of how the radio alimented it, fueled it. Perfect. Lee, you made it. Hello. Anger also comes with stereotypes. One of the most searing and debated and hardest stereotype is the angry black woman. The angry black woman that has been, yes, Pamela, there you go, that has been discussed in so many different ways. Now you see here women that have discussed the stereotype of the angry black woman, namely Roxane Gay, Brittany Cooper, and Ijeoma Oluo, and others instead that have been called angry black women, from Serena Williams, we know very well what happened with the umpire, but also Angela Davis and Audre Lorde, whose analysis of the connection between the black angry woman and the white angry woman is quite memorable. And Ava DuVernay, who has also exposed so much of that anger. So are we really getting angry, and can anger be measured? I'm not going to go in detail here, But I just want to tell you that apparently the US is not in the ranking of the world's angriest countries. The angriest of all is Armenia, apparently. It's kind of weird. I cannot find Italy there, who's pretty angry, and also the United States is not there. But Americans are very stressed and worried and angry, it seems. Not that we didn't know that. Funny thing is, you have to do a lot of qualitative indexing here before you get to the quantities, but definitely we didn't need them to tell us that Americans are more stressed and angrier. But the idea that the expression of anger is actually measurable and noticeable goes as far as Darwin. He didn't have the metrics, but he was studying already anger in animals and humans and the various physiological details and expressions that anger would assume. Of course, he was staying at the individual level and not yet going to the collective level. But it's quite interesting to notice that there are some similarities. And in the reading list, there is a whole section that's devoted to the physiological effects and expressions of anger. This measurability right now is augmented by the introduction of AI. AI can detect to such an extent the micro expressions of our face that it can actually give quotients and measurements to all of our emotions. And emotions are really the ones that are expressed in our face, and anger is one of them. So you see here, the Mona Lisa had very little anger, 0.00007%. And, well, Cindy Sherman's Untitled seems to have hardly any anger, while we know very well that it's filled with anger. And instead, Karl Rove over there has zero anger at all. So that tells you how accurate that measurement is, right? The human versus machine algorithm recognizes emotions, but what is interesting instead is the clinical anger scale. That is really fantastic. Whenever you have the pain scale or the anger scale and they ask you, I do not feel angry, I feel angry, I am angry most of the time now, I am so angry and hostile all the time that I can't stand it. That is number one. So it's really quite fascinating. You know, all these different ways to measure anger ultimately bring us to think, can we really detect anger to such an extent that we can then prevent it, you know? And you see here an example, a slide that is about extreme anger. On purpose, we blacked out the names of the murderers, one at the Episcopal Church in Charleston 2015 and the other at the mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, because, you know, we want to oblivion and indifference to actually cancel, at least in history, what they have done and at least not celebrate them. But you see here that religious crimes have declined slightly and made up only 18% of all hate crimes lately, which is quite fascinating. So there are some people that actually talk about the fact that anger is decreasing in some pockets of our society, which seems very hard to believe. We will not be able to get to any real conclusion tonight. These are just analyses and ideas that we will discuss together with a great group of panelists. We'll hear, this is not yet the lineup, but I'm going to go in clockward. I just came back from Italy, so my English is a disaster tonight. Like the clock, you know, in clockwise order. So one is Andrew Marantz. Andrew is a writer and journalist, and he just published a great book entitled Antisocial that is about all the antisocial types that are online, but he's a New Yorker writer normally in his civilian life. Marilyn Minter is a great artist, and she does art that is not angry at all, but she's wonderful, and she also participated in a project called Anger Management at the Brooklyn Museum a few years ago, and she uses actually irony and sarcasm as a way to sublimate anger and actually diffuse it sometimes. Lee Gallant is a lawyer, and he's at the ACLU here in New York. He's involved in the immigration project and in many other sides of the ACLU, and knows a lot about the kind of righteous outrage and anger that happens when injustice is deployed onto society. Then I'm going to go to Shaun Leonardo, great performance artist, activist that works a lot with youth, especially Black and brown youth, and will discuss a particular project with us that was very poignant for what we're doing tonight. Lydia Lunch, a historical performer, and to this day, writer, poet, and speaker. And last but not least, Pamela Sneed, who's also a poet and an educator at Columbia University. And their presentations will be interspersed with videos coming from Extinction Rebellion, Greg Bordovitz, Rachel Yehuda, academics, journalists like Lindsay Snell, Lausanne Collective, a collective of artists and activists that is involved in what's currently going on in Hong Kong, Daryl Wing Su, another academic here at Columbia University, and David Anderson. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the first video by David Anderson and then our first speech by Lydia Lunch. So tune in the video, please.
For me, the question depends on what you mean by biological and what you mean by anger. Psychologists think of anger as a subjective conscious experience or feeling. Does this feeling have a biological component? That's like asking whether the subjective feeling of seeing redness has a biological component. Of course, you need your eye and your brain to see red, but we don't really know how the feeling part arises. That's a mystery. I think of anger as a motivational state that drives aggression. Aggression is used throughout the animal kingdom by fruit flies, fish, mice, apes, people to obtain mates or defend territory. That sounds pretty biological in the sense of innate and evolutionarily ancient. However, aggression isn't always driven by anger. Professional soldiers fight because they're paid, not because they're mad. Conversely, anger is not always physically expressed. We'd all be hitting each other every time we were insulted or offended. We learned to control it. Our biological capacity for anger was selected by evolution acting on our genes over hundreds of millions of years. But that doesn't mean it can't be modified by experience. In the same way, our capacity for language was also selected by evolution over hundreds of millions of years. But which language we speak depends on where we grew up. So the next time you get angry, don't ask whether it's nature or nurture, it's both. The question for us is how and where in the brain these forces converge.
All right, Lydia, please go to the stage. Thank you.
You know, people are often telling me to calm down. Why are you so aggressive? So angry? So violent? And I admit, I feel like I do have a murderous bloodline. Sicilian, German, American, triple fascismo that I have to fight against. But I don't sweat the small shit. I mean, I do sometimes get violent. I've been known to slap a bitch or a bitch boy once or a dozen times, but usually because they deserved it or often because they requested it. So that I could help them erase their father's fists from their face, the same way that I use dick to erase my father's dick from my face. Yeah. But I don't sweat the small shit. I mean, I never get mad at my lovers. I never get into arguments. My friends, an asshole on the street. I don't have sidewalk rage. It's not hashtag me too. It's actually hashtag you're next. It's like someone grabs my ass. If I don't, and how could they resist? I just go up, I just whisper real soft in their ear that I will crack your fucking dick. And then I will kill you with a throat punch. And yeah, I mean it. But I'm not really angry when I say that. I mean, why get mad when you can get even? I mean, there are some things that piss me off. Like Mexican mothers burying their 10-year-old daughters alive, guaranteeing sainthood, which is better than these small girls having to become drug mules for the cartels, who will eventually disembowel them and leave them in the desert anywhere if they resist. I have to admit, I get kind of angry about that. I get pretty pissed off on a daily basis, but this is on a grand scale, having to tally all the fucking bullshit by that pathological liar that sits in the White House. 14,032 lies in 1,054 days, and who's counting? Well, I fucking am. And he should not be impeached. He should be fucking impaled, if you ask me, for his mantra, "I'll grab him by the pussy." I'd like to grab him by the fucking nuts and twist. He's a fucking pig on Pennsylvania Avenue who thinks the only good immigrant is one that he can fuck and parade like as if it's a dog and pony show, as he rips babies from their mother's arms and puts them in cages. But then again, we knew his father was a Nazi sympathizer. Now, Melania must be the highest paid call girl in the country. I just don't fucking get it. And we have all seen the evidence of them partying with that baby freak pedophile Epstein, who, you know what, trafficked dozens, if not hundreds of girls to princes, presidents, and heads of states. All their heads should be on the fucking chopping block. And if he wasn't already dead or murdered, I gladly would have fucking done it. Don't worry about that. One throat punch will do. And it just goes to prove exactly what the Marquis de Sade was already saying 300 years ago. And if you don't understand what his philosophy was, it was basically that the bourgeoisie can fucking kill whatever they want to. And yeah, I do get angry, but I don't sweat the small shit. I don't get angry on it in my personal life. I never yell at anybody. I was never a professional dominatrix. I faced 2 race riots and lived in what was a mini war between the age of 5 and 8 with a father who was a psychosexual deviant. I might have been angry as a child, but after I flatlined, I was able to actually build in the emotions I wanted, and I decided to cut out anything that was cancer-causing. Jealousy, insecurity, humiliation, shame. I do not know these feelings as a fembot, and the anger I portray in my art is for those that have a mouth but cannot scream. Am I pissed off at the world? Yes, but I'm never pissed off at the individual person because they have just as much a right to be a fucking asshole as I do. Thank you very much.
Whoa. Thank you. Way to go.
So what does anger mean to Extinction Rebellion? I mean, we talk about, and we've talked about being angry but peaceful, but where is our anger from?
I think anger in our movement comes as a sort of natural part of the grieving process, and it's also something which you can find in a sort of relationship with love as well.
When we love someone, we can easily be angry with them, but we can also forgive them. And actually, you know, I suppose there's an element of forgiveness in the anger of Extinction Rebellion, because our anger comes from years of not doing anything about something.
And I think that's key, isn't it? That we have to go beyond just anger, so we have to forgive.
And it's a matter of doing a lot of personal work, because you can't help but be angry with yourself, angry with the people around you, and angry with the situation.
In the actions, there's an immediate need for us to not fear anger and to be able to kind of hold other people's anger and not react to it and somehow synthesize it into something more positive.
And hopefully some of the artwork helps diffuse the anger.
We're kind of acknowledging that anger is more important than that. It's a continuing, sustainable thing, not just something where you're going to throw a rock at someone and feel better about yourself and go back to being the problem.
That's where it becomes love, I guess.
More anger. We
More
need
news.
more anger.
Leave it there?
Yeah.
Search for anger in Hong Kong on Google News, and you will find 104,000 returns dating from June the 12th. Even as keywords suture affect and place, interlaced vectors of outrage belie straightforward imaginations of collective anger. For Hong Kong, conceptualizing its anger as a singular collective is to produce a means of control. Collective anger mops up the spillage of rage, turning its overflow into a systematic, inured routine. Orientalism prescribes this rage, scripting and rehearsing it in advance to tame it with anticipations of bourgeois civility. Failure to perform accordingly breeds backlash. Anger is leveraged against the disenfranchised as a mark of irrationality or powerlessness and revolt, obscuring the fact that anger also guides us towards justice. In Xian Ngai's words, the observation that justice conversely requires anger underscores the passion centrality to political struggles throughout history. In a regime of regulated feeling, how much room can collective anger make for rage that is offensive, inconvenient, and unruly?
By the way, we kind of lost the first slide, but that was Lausan Collective, and some of them are here in the front row, so thank you. Andrew, can I call you to the podium, please? Andrew Marantz.
Hi, guys. Okay, so I'm Andrew Marantz. I spent the last few years hanging out with some of the worst people on the internet, and they experience a lot of anger. So if you've been online recently, you might have noticed that there's a lot of toxic garbage out there, and the internet is kind of made of it these days. And so I'm a journalist, I'm a reporter at The New Yorker and elsewhere, and I wanted to see who was making this stuff happen. Because a lot of times, you know, you hear a kind of generalized discourse about this stuff that, oh, it's the Russians or it's bots or, you know, and all of those things. It's good to pay attention to the Russians and to the bots and stuff, but a lot of this stuff is just us. It's just what we Americans are doing to ourselves without being anonymous or even breaking any of the rules of the way these networks were built. It's actually the way the networks were designed to be built. So I started tracking back memes like this one and tracing them to their source and sort of who was spreading them. So that's George Soros. He's a billionaire philanthropist, and to a lot of kind of conspiracy-minded folks online, he's also the source of all the world's problems. And this is obviously playing on one of the oldest anti-Semitic tropes in existence, that there's a secret cabal of rich Jews who are secretly running the world. And I didn't really realize this until I spent 4 years digging into this stuff. But not only are there people who believe this, but this stuff is kind of at the center of their ideology and their cosmology. I mean, I realized that, but I didn't really realize it. So with stuff like this, I wanted to see not only like how is some weirdo in someone's basement making this, because it takes 2 seconds to make something like this, but how is it spreading into the center of the global discourse, right? How is it being smuggled from the fringes into the center? So I would hang out with the people as they were doing it, because that's the kind of fly-on-the-wall reporting I like to do. So, you know, one day I was in the living room of a guy in Orange County, California, who was not a 14-year-old in his mother's basement. He was a 40-year-old married guy. He was actually married to a woman who was of Iranian descent, even though he was kind of like a proto-white nationalist. These things get very complex and hypocritical very quickly. And he had like a dog and a daughter, and it all seemed very kind of domestic and placid. And I said, well, what are you going to do today? And he said, well, I'm going to... It wasn't this. It was pre-2016 election. He wanted to associate Hillary Clinton with something that would create anger or fear or disgust in his audience, because he understood that even though the rhetoric of social media was that it was going to make the world more open and connected, and it was going to bring us all together and make the world shiny and happy and democratic, the way it actually worked, if you reverse engineer how the algorithms work, is that the algorithms are meant to incentivize whoever can incite the sharpest and most immediate emotion. And the emotions that are easiest to incite most quickly and on a mass scale are antisocial emotions, which is part of why that ended up being the title of my book, because even though the rhetoric about social media is pro-social, we're going to have democratic uprisings, we're going to have Tahrir Square, the actual effects tend in an antisocial direction. So on that day, he said, look, I have my personal critiques of Hillary Clinton and her relationships with the Saudis and whatever, but that's not what's going to resonate in a viral way. What's going to resonate is anger, fear, rage, suspicion, disgust. So he sat down at his kitchen table, living room table. It was all just kind of one room. And he set up an iPad, and I'm just going to get rid of this image because it's gross. And he just set up an iPad and said, all right, guys, he opened a Periscope. Periscope is a live streaming app. And he said, all right, he had about 1,000 or 2,000 of his hardcore followers and fans in there. And I write about dozens of these people in my book. This is just one example. What's our hashtag going to be? There had just been a bomb that had gone off in New York, and the guy accused of planting the bomb had a name that sounded kind of Muslim. So he wanted to create an association. Okay, Hillary wants open borders, which she didn't, whatever. And this guy obviously came in through those open borders and planted a bomb. Also not true because the guy was an American citizen. So it wasn't, neither of these things was really true. But he wanted to create the association between these two things. So he said, what's our hashtag going to be? And they all started typing in the comments, Hillary loves terrorists, migrants are terrorists, whatever. And he would kind of weed them out and say, that one's too on the nose. That one might get banned. That one actually is too cutesy. That's going to make people laugh. It's not going to create the right emotional response. And then they picked one, and they went with it, and they got it trending on Twitter. Once it was trending on Twitter, it goes through this news cycle of Drudge Report, cable news, into the newspaper, literally to the point that I went back to my hotel, picked up the newspaper the next morning, and saw the news has this guy's fingerprints on it. And so over the course of the next 3 years or so, I documented how the news is daily shaped by individuals who are just raising their hands and volunteering for this, and not hiding their identities. So the reason I use that example is that, I mean, the main thing to leave with here, and we can talk about this more in the question part, is that this is not an accident, right? It might have been unintended. It's not necessarily the case that the people who created these social networks wanted this to happen, but it's not an accident in the sense that it is a product of how they are designed, right? The original premise, as I said, is this is going to make the world more open and connected and bring us together. And some of that obviously happened. There's Black Lives Matter, there's Me Too movement, all that stuff. It's not fully one-sided, but the issue is that when you incentivize for what scientists call emotional engagement or high activation emotions, the science is just clear. The way that you hit people at high activation emotional flashpoints, it's going to tend more in a fear, disgust, rage direction. So when people talk about the people that I reported on, I called it the bad guys on the internet beat. People say alt-right, people say civic nationalist, whatever. When you talk about those people, you often hear people say they're hijacking these platforms or they're hacking these platforms. And I think that's not really true, right? Because they're using the platforms the way they were meant to be used. They're just very successful entrepreneurial activists or messengers who are taking essentially no resources and turning them into the substance of our continued national conversation. So anger is not only a constant that has always existed in our society, and misinformation has always existed, but we now have massive accelerants that have been poured onto this fire, and they're getting bigger every day. And so I've been calling it an informational crisis that's on par with the climate crisis or the city infrastructure crisis or the opioid crisis, where if we want to fix it, we have to unwind a lot of very individual, specific human decisions that have been made. In my book tour, I've been encountering a lot of people who think that, well, this is sort of a big system. Because it's so big, it almost feels like fated to happen, or it feels like we're doomed to repeat this. And the one thing, I'm not generally a silver linings or optimism person, as you can probably tell, but the one silver lining that I have been finding is that we built this, which means we can unbuild it. It's not like, in the same way that the world was not fated to get 4 degrees warmer in the next 10 years Celsius, it was not fated to have an informational crisis where 2.4 billion people are locked together in anger and fear and disgust. We can change those incentives and those design structures, and it's not actually that hard. We just need to create the pressures that will force the people in charge to do that. So, thanks.
Thank you. Video, thank you.
ways to have chronic anger. The first is you have a short fuse, and so this is temperamentally the way you deal with all of life's challenges. You become angry and you're angry all the time. The second way to be chronically angry is that there are just so many problems in the world, like social injustice and violence and climate change. You just don't feel that you can deal with any of those problems from a place of calmness or complacency. Anger is very much like fear. It's fundamentally adaptive because it makes you take action, particularly when it's not your natural state. So biologically, the experience of anger will increase blood flow to your organs and to your cardiovascular system and your nervous system, and this will mobilize you to act. And that way, it's not unlike fight or flight. But being chronically angry can lead to all kinds of negative effects, even if it started out for the right reasons. Like these are low self-esteem or poorer quality relationships, makes you more prone to addiction, anxiety, depression, even increases your probability of having physical disorders because of the effect on blood pressure and on the immune system's ability to fight off infection. So unlike the kind of anger that is the exception to the natural way we are in the world, chronic anger doesn't often get the job done because chronic anger travels with so many other qualities like bitterness or jealousy or cynicism, and it's very hard to be serene and peaceful when we're having a lot of negative feelings. So the trap that we find ourselves in is that when there's a lot to get angry at, we want to do it so that anger can be a galvanizing agent of change. But if we flip that switch too often, even when there's a lot to get angry at, we just have to make sure that the anger doesn't become our natural state. It's important to really decide whether something is worth getting angry about, and always it's important to be controlling the anger and not having the anger controlling us. And even at the height of our anger, we have to find ways to embrace compassion for ourselves and those whom we're angry at.
That was Rachel Yehuda, the director of the Traumatic Stress Studies Division at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine. And we had asked her, what are the physiological effects of chronic anger? So it was quite an interesting answer. And now I would like to call to the podium Marilyn Minter.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Minter. I'm an artist, and actually this wasn't supposed to be my first slide, but here it is. I'm going to talk about some of the things I've been doing and some of the things that I've been collecting. And I'm paraphrasing this quote from Margaret Atwood, who I really love this quote. And she says, "Why do men feel threatened by women?" I asked a male friend of mine. "They're afraid of women will laugh at them," he said, "undercut their worldview." Then I asked some women students in a quickie poetry seminar I was giving, "Why do women feel threatened by men?" And they said that they're afraid of being killed. So I thought I'd channel my anger into humor and absurdity, and these are some of the things I've been collecting. So now I'm going to present this as if it just was shown now. This is one of the things I also did about 5 years ago. I listened to NPR, and I was listening to the trap laws that were happening all over the South and the Midwest for Planned Parenthood trying to sabotage reproductive rights. And so I started working with them, and I made these pins. These are not official Planned Parenthood pins, by the way. And I put them in printed matter in places in LA and sold them, and they're $3 and $2, and it's just to raise money. All the proceeds go to Planned Parenthood. And the way Planned Parenthood loves these pins, but like I said, they're not official. This is what I like to show this young lady, Miley Cyrus, because she was really the first very young person that lent her name to Planned Parenthood to raise money. And I got to shoot her and sold these photos to raise money for Planned Parenthood. And she went on Jimmy Fallon.
happyhippies.org.
Yes, please.
You're releasing a T-shirt today?
This just came out today. It's a collab with Marilyn Minter and Marc Jacobs for Planned Parenthood.
And when she did that, we literally sold these out in a week. So I have to give her props for being one of the first young people who put, because a lot of celebrities were afraid that they'd lose, people wouldn't go to their movies in some of these areas of the country. So minute that Trump got elected, I started working with this anarchist group called, well, we actually formed it, called Dear Ivanka. And this is one of the protests we did in front of the Puck Building, using the infamous pussy grab quote. And I actually heard from someone that someone on Breitbart talked about this as being very funny. And I never saw it. But this is, we, of course, not for a minute did we think that Ivanka Trump was going to lift a finger to protect us from her father. But these are the kinds of things we did for the first 6 months he was in office. And this was in front of their house. This is Ivanka and Gerard house on Park Avenue, and they were about to move to Washington, D.C., so we wanted them to help them move, and we wanted them to remember to bring abortion rights, freedom of speech, climate change with them. So we made boxes, and we protested in front of their living quarters, and of course, we got a lot of press for it. I started making these plaques out of my studio, and selling them out of my studio and in certain venues around the city, and to raise money. And I was working with still with Dear Ivanka, and they were a real anarchist group, and they did not want to raise money. So, but we did do this wheat pasting on National Women's Day a few years ago, all over the city. So everyone woke up to this wheat pasting of the Trump plaque. And this is like one of the videos somebody took. You can read it, I hope. The President of the United States. So one of the other things I did during this time was make a resist flag for creative time. And this was actually up the first visit that Trump came to New York City after the election. And it was on the Lever House. And the guy's name is A.B. Rosen, who wanted to do it, but other people that worked, I guess they were the tenants of Lever House. They objected because he was going to do a talk at the Pan Am building right down the street. So they did take it down. They did censor it, which was too bad. Then pretty much right after that, my friend, the curator, Adriana Campbell, and I came up with this project to do at the Brooklyn Museum, one of the few places that would let us have something like this. And I got a lot of artists that are pretty well known, make $3 items or $20 T-shirts, $30 T-shirts. And we sold them from September to Christmas just to raise money for the ACLU and Planned Parenthood. And some of my friends, Lori Simmons made a resistance thong, and she would like hand stencil resistance and use studs and glitter, and they sold very well. And then these are some of the things that I'm inspired by. And these are anti-Nazi demonstrators in Knoxville, Tennessee. And there are people that dressed up as bride power, so white wife power. And then the other slide is the Pillsbury Doughboy, white flour, instead of white power. And so I love that these people do that. And I've been collecting them over the years.
And this is what stupid looks like.
Let me get my
So my goal is to get people to hire tuba players to troll every single one of these fascist groups, every place they go. Because, I mean, it really would look so dumb if they beat up a tuba player. That's embarrassing. This is the Finnish group, Loaders of Odin, who formed to protest the anti-immigrant soldiers of Odin. They're the Ku Klux Klans. And here's some of the Ku Klux Klans. I love this. Racism isn't appealing, dressed as a banana. And I just think, the idea that the patriarchy is afraid of being laughed at, and they sort of know what to do with Antifa, and they don't really know what to do when they're being laughed at. And this is a friend of mine, Ryan McGinley.
Don't trade your sexuality for your eternity.
I can't hear you because of all the dicks in your mouth.
I was in the car with him in Houston, and we just rode around the block so we could do this. And then this is the thing I'm doing right now. It's a video called My Country 'Tis of Thee, C-U-N-T. Because if we're going to be called cunts, we're going to shove it down their throat. And it was the different models writing things like My Country 'Tis of Thee, Au contraire, cunt foo, cunt temporary. And it's a 7-minute video, and I'm actually about to start a whole bunch of other new projects, and stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you.
For the past decade or so, my research team and I have been studying the manifestations, dynamics, and impact of microaggressions on the lived reality of people of color. One of the things about microaggressions is that they are perpetrated by well-intentioned individuals who are unaware that they have engaged in a demeaning, invalidating, offensive way towards people of color. Microaggressions tend to deny the humanity of people of color, tends to deny their racialized experiences and who they are as racial cultural beings. Many reactions and emotions are generated when a person of color experiences a microaggression. Among them is anger, anger at being denied their own identity and humanity. It is important for us to realize that anger is not a manifestation, an unhealthy manifestation to a healthy society, but rather a healthy response to a sick one. Thank you.
Yay. There you go. Shaun Leonardo.
Thank you for that video precursor, because it gets to the point of what I'm going to share with you, in that anger, more often than not, is a disguise for fear. Anger is an easier expression, an external one that allows you to block the pain and vulnerability that goes with fear, the fear of being dehumanized, as was just so clearly stated here. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about this project that I staged about a year ago at the Guggenheim, where I convened 4 different groups, all with a unique relationship to gun violence. The New York Police Department, military veterans, a group that I coined Citizens Impacted by Street Violence, and finally a group that I called Recreational Users of Firearms. Now, the invitation was to go through a workshop process that would culminate in a moment where they had to reckon with one another and debate the issue of gun violence, but without the use of words, transforming the Guggenheim into a gladiatorial arena. What preceded this moment was 4 months of workshops with each group affiliation separately. In a methodology that I've been developing over the last few years, in which We translate personal experiences and narratives into performative gestures without the use of the words. And really what I was inviting them to do was dial specifically into what their experiences of conflict looked like. Not what language we would use to describe it, but instead, quite literally, what the choreography, whether learned or innate, conscious or unconscious, how that flowed through their bodies. And what I really came to discover, well, let me say this. The entire process started simply with a conversation with each group affiliation, also separately, on their home turf. And the first question I asked them was, what word would you use? What word would you use to describe a value that is the glue of this group affiliation? How would you define yourself through this value? And so for the NYPD, that word was duty. Quite literally what it means to wake up every morning and do better on behalf of someone else. For military veterans, that was a word like honor. Not necessarily for the country, but to one another. Quite literally what it looks like and means to be able to die for someone else. For those that were navigating the violence of the streets, that was loyalty. That in the chaos of your surroundings, quite often all you have are that few members of your crew that might protect you. And maybe not surprisingly for gun owners, that word was something like skill. That the years and years of training grants them the privilege to wield that power. And what it comes down to is that any threat to that value, as perceived from an outside community, then manifests itself in an angry expression. So let me be a little more clear. When we all do this, we develop a belief system to protect that value, even if it requires lying. So this belief system that is meant to develop the barriers around that core value, the way we see ourselves, the way we want to be seen in the world, that belief system reiterates a worldview that then in return creates an identity that we so dearly want to hold on to. So anything that might challenge our worldview becomes an insult to our core value. And the ways in which that fear, the fear of having to let go, the fear of having your worldview be disrupted on any level, inevitably results in anger. And so what I did in engaging the groups is really try to codify what that expression then looks like. And I used these terms mirror, shatter, deflect. And so quite often in communication, particularly in political debate, what you might see is a mirror. In other words, you have two parties entering an argument. And what you see then is the two individuals with prepared speaking points simply mirror one another. So they're like, you say something, I'm going to say something. We're basically saying nothing, but we're just going to keep referring to our speaking points. Again, that solidify that worldview. In shatter, what you might then witness is someone simply talking louder than the other person, or just straight up insulting the person as a way to win that argument. And then finally, in deflect, you might answer me a question. I'll decide to answer some other shit. I'm going to move the conversation the way I want to dictate it. And so what you sense then is that communication has failed before it's even begun. And for my last remaining time, I want to speak specifically about one of these groups. young men and women of color that are forced to navigate violence in their surroundings. A few years ago, I founded a program with the nonprofit Recess entitled Assembly. It's a diversion program engaging directly in the court system. These are court-involved youth ages 18 to 25 who have been arrested for misdemeanor charges. And I'm proud to say that as of recently, we've quietly moved into felony charges. And after a cycle of workshops very much following the same methodology, their cases can be closed and their records sealed. And I would identify in these bodies is a level of fear that is so often misconstrued as anger. Ta-Nehisi Coates states in recent literature and in talks that the most unique expression of the Black experience is fear. We don't know what it's like to navigate the world without fear. And it manifests itself in our young folks in the ways they attempt to take up space, whether it's on the subway or on the stoop or the street corner, in the way that our volume goes up and is called screaming, in the ways that we simply try to protect ourselves. And for us, you know, this is not theoretical and or conceptual. All you have to do is spend time with a young brother who has suffered from violent trauma to understand that there is a physical reaction. This fear is housed within our bodies, a fear of having our bodies taken away or held captive, and it stays stored. So it should come as no surprise then when a young person who has to navigate violence in their everyday, both with folks that look like themselves and in front of those who are supposed to protect and serve, that they take matters in their own hand and decide to be strapped, to have a gun. Because we are so often taught to replace that anger with the only expression that is immediately available, to replace or disguise fear with anger. The problem is that that anger, as is portrayed or misconstrued by communities of power, law enforcement, white communities, is so often the very thing that takes their lives. Because that thing that is being misconstrued as an angry expression rather than fear is the very definition that is then justified when someone's shot. And so these images that you will see are one of the few public programs that has been shared by the Assembly program. Much of what we do, as you can imagine, is anonymous. And what I will share with you is that it's become my responsibility to address this fear head on, to find ways in which I might actually help a young brother save their own life. And the only way I can see myself or find myself accountable to this work is to locate any way in which fear might be used more productively. And I think that's probably a life's work. Thank you.
This is pretty shocking, and I didn't really know how to react to that, but the question he changed from when is the expression of anger efficacious to when is anger? When is anger? And he responded this way. I would like now to call Legal Learned.
Hi, I'm a lawyer at the ACLU. As a lawyer, I think I'm sort of the odd person out here. I have nothing sort of artistic or philosophical to say about anger. I actually was interested in coming more to hear everyone else speak. And you know, in particular, I think we at the ACLU, you know, constantly, we spend all our time, besides the technical legal work, figuring out how are we going to persuade people of things. And I think what we have not done as good enough job at is reaching out to other communities who are good at, or at least have different ways, and probably better than us, at communicating. And I think the artistic community in particular is a community that we haven't done a good enough job of partnering with. You heard Marilyn talk about some of the stuff she's done for Planned Parenthood and for the ACLU, and I think there are a lot of artists doing things, but I think more of it can be done. And, you know, and the ACLU has a tricky relationship with, I think, collective anger. You know, I'll come in every morning and there could be 10 messages on my machine, and 5 of them will be, I got your phone number and I just want to say that I hope your family dies and you're a communist jerk and blah, blah, blah. And then there'll be 5 that say, you know, I'm so angry at what's going on with this administration. How can I help? Can I donate? And I think that's always been, you know, we've always sort of been a vessel for anger on both sides. I actually really just have more questions that I wanted to raise and hope that we can talk about on the panel and hear some of the other panelists' views about it, because we are struggling to figure out exactly how to always get our message out and persuade people. And I just want to tell you very quickly about a case that I've been working on for about 18 months that I had hoped, assumed would be over by now, but hasn't been. And some of the questions, I think the larger questions it raises about anger and about communication for us. It involves the separation of families at the border, and I suspect most of you have heard about it over the last 18 months. And so what happened in the beginning of this administration was they decided they were going to take children away from their parents coming to the country to seek asylum, most of them at the border. And I brought a suit back in March of 2018, and at the time we thought maybe there were a couple of hundred families that had been separated and that most of the children were on the older side. We've recently learned that, and it's still going on, and the numbers are still growing, that at least 5,500 families have now been separated, 5,500 children, and many, many of them, hundreds, just little babies or toddlers, even under a year old, ripped from their parents and taken away. And what we've also learned now, I think what was probably obvious to most people, but now has come out in documents, is that the administration thought if we make it so unbearable for the families, they'll no longer come and seek asylum here. You know, and there is lots of cases, and I think maybe more objectively horrible than the ones that sort of stick in my mind, but some of them just stick in my mind for whatever reason. You know, a little 4-year-old boy from Honduras came with his mother, and he needed glasses. He was wearing glasses when he got here. And the parents in Honduras had scraped together, they were very modest means, that had scraped together the money to buy him glasses. And they had also scraped the money together to buy him glasses cases. And those glasses cases became the biggest thing in their life, because they knew that if his glasses ever broke, they could never get him another pair. And when they came to take him away, he was screaming and crying, "Please don't take me away from my mommy." They took him away, and fortunately he was wearing his glasses, but they didn't let the mother go get the glasses case. So all day long, all the mother thought about is, can my little boy see? If the glasses break, will they get him another pair of glasses? Will they give him a place to keep the glasses safe? Another father told us that they knew they were going to take his 7-year-old boy away. And he just asked them, can I have a couple of minutes to try and brace him for what's going to happen, just to tell him they're going to take him away. No, they didn't give him the couple of minutes. They came and just screamed out, we're taking your child away now. Just one little horrible story like that after another. And it produced an outrage. I suspect most of you know, last summer, not this past summer, but the summer of 2018, and it transcended political lines, Democratic and Republican lines, conservative or liberal. Laura Bush came out and wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying, look, we can have disagreements about macro immigration policy, but we can't take 5- and 6-month-old babies away. The Pope came out, religious leaders came out, and there was real public outcry, and it made a difference. And so for us, the issues that it raises are, how do we keep that in the spotlight since it's still going on? And someone mentioned, I think one of the other panelists on the video, sort of, can you keep that anger up all the time? And is it healthy? And it's probably not healthy. And that's one of the things that we constantly have to struggle with, because this administration, more than any other prior administration, is literally doing something outrageous on a weekly basis. So can we be constantly asking the public to be outraged every week, or do we have to pick our spots? The other question it raises, I think, for me is raising people's anger, what the administration doing, the best way to go about it, or is looking for the sympathy, the empathy for these children? Or are they sort of interchangeable? Is it anger at the administration for doing it, or is it sympathy for the children? And I think for us, there's always a way to get to our base, and either one of those works, anger at the administration or sympathy for the children. And there's probably no way to get to the people that you were talking about in your book. But it's the people in the middle. And so is it better for us to try and say you ought to be angry at what this administration's doing, or to constantly show stories of the little children and appeal to empathy? And maybe there's no difference. And what's the relationship between fear and anger? After 9/11, when I was doing cases, you could see palpable fear in everyone, including judges that I appeared before. And many of the people who supported the ACLU down the line were all of a sudden not our friends, or at least not outwardly our friends, because they were so fearful of what might happen. September 15th, September 18th in New York City, no one wanted to hear about civil liberties issues, related to terrorism. So for us, it's a constant thought process. How do we reach the most people? How do we persuade? I mean, that's what we do as advocates. And where does the role of anger come in? And I also think about it from a personal standpoint. Is it beneficial for me to be angry, or to let it seep into the work I do? Am I a better lawyer if I'm angry, or does it keep me from seeing the other side of issues, keep me from appealing to moderate judges and moderates who I have to talk to? So I think for us, it's a complicated relationship, and that's why I think this is such an interesting salon, and to hear from people who come at it from a different approach. Thank you.
I've been reporting from Syria for the past 7 years, and in this time I've encountered so many angry people and so many frustrated people. And I think of all the different types of anger that I've encountered, both collective and individual anger, the type I found to be the most constructive is that which has motivated people to make their voices heard. The idea that nothing will improve, that no change will happen if their suffering is kept private. It's what led a generation of young people in opposition-held Syria to become journalists, little more than their cell phones and social media. It's what helped them show the world what it was like to live in an area that was ravaged by shortages and constantly targeted by bombs. And now it's what leads the people of northeastern Syria to do the same in the face of a massive invasion. I think that this specific sort of motivational anger serves two purposes. It empowers the storytellers, and it informs the world.
And I would like now to call our dessert, as I called her, Pamela's Need.
I'm angry about that banana. $120,000 when people are starving in the world. And so the collage that's up there is a series, part of a series that I made, I think last year, 2 years ago, when that gunman burst into a temple and shot those people. Philadelphia, yeah? Pittsburgh, okay. Speaking to my former student at SAIC, a writer and visual artist, they say that there's not one day that passes when at some point he doesn't return to the first reading I gave to the class on Audre Lorde, The Transformation of Silence into Language in Action, and Poetry is Not a Luxury. In a final paper, another student said she was floored, but in the end grateful for the Audre Lorde checklist I handed out at the start of class, asking, what are the words that you do not yet have? What do you need to say? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own until you will sicken and die from them, still in silence? List them and write a new list tomorrow and the day after. This in mind, when I think about the image in words, silence equals death. Like my students, I return to the master teacher, Black lesbian warrior, poet, mother, cancer survivor, Audre Lorde. I return also to the essay, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action, with the instructions for living, silence will not protect you. In this great dragon called America that attempts to wipe us out, in its machinery that attempts to grind us into dust, it is better to speak knowing we were never meant to survive. So yesterday, when I saw that poster, Silence Equals Death, in the windows of Leslie Lohman Museum, that pink triangle on black paper from blocks away, it called to me like a beacon. Amidst societal madness, personal struggles, the Trump presidency, to never give up. It reminded me, too, of a great generation of gay and lesbian warriors who are no longer here with us, fell to AIDS and cancer, but on their deathbeds used the mantra to inspire silence equals death. I think about when Black, gay, and Latino poets Essex Hemphill, Donald Woods, Dawn Reed, Roy Gonzalez, Rory Buchanan, David Frechette, Craig Harris, Alan Williams, and Asado Saint, and so many more was still here. How their black hair began to sprout twists and knots, go wild and kinky to signify early black gay consciousness. I also think about when I first met Donald Woods outside of a bookstore in the West Village called A Different Light, and we fell in love. We were all so young, black, awkward, and gangly, but fierce and determined. Donald was Audre Lorde's student at Hunter. For all of us, black, gay, and lesbian struggling to find our way, Lorde was our guru. I think about poetry readings that happened all the time at the community center on 13th Street. We were upstairs while ACT UP met downstairs. There were black, gay, and bisexual poets Stormy Weber, Cheryl Clark, Jewel Gomez, Sapphire. As black gay people, we couldn't afford to get arrested, so we wrote, performed, and sang revolution, like the salons of the Harlem Renaissance featuring Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes. Those meetings informed me forever. I also saw plague and cancer decimate my people. People I imagined growing old with, artists who knew at the time that they only had moments and seconds to live, so they wrote. It was right after his diagnosis I saw Asado Saint performing on top of the tables at the Gay and Lesbian Community Center. I will also never forget when he stormed the pulpit at Donald Woods' funeral. I learned what it was to make work with urgency, as Audrey said, as though your life depended upon it, to know that you couldn't waste moments or a second. I learned more about being an artist in the early 90s than any college education ever taught me. It was from little boys with baby faces and death sentences who spoke and forced themselves into the world at all odds. I learned from little and big boys and girls in the face of catastrophe, raising their fists as Avram did last night, using the mantra, silence equals death. I used to always write about a sort of saint, slamming his hand down on the pulpit at Donald's funeral, when it was common to hide the cause of death of young men who died of AIDS, if they were buried at all and weren't abandoned. Someone told me about a thin boy, thin with fear and death, played the piano for the choir. No one touched him or talked about it. I know in my mother's family, her mother's sister said Parasite had killed her son when he died suddenly. But I remember him once coming out of a gay bar in Boston, and all the white boys said, "How do you know her?" And I don't know if it was he or I who said his cousin. I'm his cousin. He made me promise not to tell anyone in the family I'd seen him there. So when they said Parasite, I knew something didn't ring true. His mother, a seemingly healthy woman, died shortly after that, but I always felt their deaths were related. His mother, either from the lies or repression or a broken heart, having lost her young son. And I know everyone blames Jussie Smollett for his lies and staged attack, but it makes me think that there was something very toxic going on, that he didn't feel that he could talk to someone. Either that or he was covering up an addiction or a hookup. But nonetheless, watching Assato Saint stand up at Donald's funeral and tell the truth goes down in history as one of the bravest moments I'd ever witnessed. Either that or Audre Lorde spreading open the arms of her dashiki, the bravest woman that we'd all witnessed, telling a crowd of followers, "I began on this journey as a coward." That, or seeing a friend of mine at the height of the AIDS era at a bar covered in purple welts, refusing to hide, going out in public. That, or Donald Woods being feeble, barely able to walk, accepting an award as director of AIDS films. Or an ex-lover on a beach taking off her top and refusing to hide her mastectomy scar. Or when Denitra Vance performed at the Public Theater and danced naked, revealed her mastectomy scars. And Audrey refusing to wear a prosthesis. When Zach Mokai and Master Harold and the Boys, the first Broadway play that a cousin took me to, said to his white master, "Have you ever seen a black man's ass?" and pulled down his pants and revealed himself to the audience. I was 6 years old. That, or seeing my mother beaten religiously and still go out to work as if it hadn't happened at all. Or me surviving so many incredible tests. And once when I was talking to a doctor, I doubted my strength, and he looked at me incredulously and said, "You are strong." Another doctor looked at me, my suffering, and he said, "Isn't anyone there for you?" And another said, "You deserve to be taken care of." Today, once more, I am nursing my broken heart, caused by someone who betrayed, was not honest. That and attending an event and asking white people to give up their seats to blacks who couldn't sit down, and seeing social justice in action. Yes, I often think of Assato for the important place he resides in my history, but today I'm examining his tactics, pulling the tools off the shelf, dusting off the weaponry in an exhibit, because today I need to use what he taught me. Today I feel that puff of rage, that continuous assault, and I want to stand up. I want to testify, though I haven't been asked. I want to interrupt all the proceedings, all the places black lesbians have been erased and silenced, like looking down at a manuscript and seeing that they asked a young white woman to write about black queer history when it's been my area of expertise forever, or only attributing 80s and 90s AIDS activism to ACT UP. I want the point of outrage now to not only be the historicizing of AIDS, but the fact that women and black lesbians have been erased from the dialogue. When there were so many organizations like GMAD, Other Countries, Adodi, Men of All Colors Together, Salsa Soul, Las Buenas Amigas, and more, or asking where are all the black lesbians on Pose, because certainly they were on the piers and part of that history, and why are white men constantly at the helm to tell our stories, and why don't white queers recognize this, that, and seeing panel after panel being organized on history and art and all things important to the world, and no one thinking or noticing it might be important to have a black lesbian present, just like they kicked Stormé out of the Stonewall narrative. And what about people who weren't on the streets but in jobs, fighting the system, the dykes and the queers, meeting each other and forming community and connections and family and love, just like in South Africa where they prevented intermingling, but ways were found. And each time we touched or loved and found each other in darkness and in light, it was resistance. And every time we told each other, you are beautiful, you are not wrong, it was resistance. Every time we stood up to the parents and the families and the courts and those that shunned us, it was resistance. When we wore what we really wanted to wear, when we yelled at the doctors and the drug professionals, it was resistance. Every war in this country is fought on our bodies. Every time we wrote and read poems, it was resistance. Every time some queer kid stays alive because they saw us, read us, discovered the archive, we've won. And one day after the gender, racial, sexual orientation wars are over in America, there will be a new generation, just like in South Africa, called the Born Frees. I chose two of these poems because they embody history and the power of what rage channeled into action can do. I often reference the story of Asotto Saint, a poet, when he interrupted the funeral of Donald Woods, refusing to hide the cause of what Donald really died from, which was AIDS. I believe in the United States we are not angry enough, that we are watching the world at this moment erupt with all signs of protest by the angry and disenfranchised in Iran, Hong Kong, Venezuela, Paris, Chile, Bolivia, while the population of the United States remains immobilized under reigns of a right-wing administration and a fascist dictator. We now have concentration camps in America with details of their horrors daily. Most recently, a teenager died from the flu, and there is passive acceptance. I believe that we are in a non-consensual, sadistic relationship with the government, where every day we are shocked and numbed, and that our threshold for pain has increased, and we have accepted the unthinkable as normal. The sign of a healthy society and individual is one that is able to express its feelings responsibly, that its rage is not turned inward on itself, which is the root cause of depression. It is for these reasons I chose the text, The Transformation of Silence into Language in Action, Poetry is Not a Luxury, and Eye to Eye by Audre Lorde. Thank you.
Thank you. See, I was standing by you big. Please, come on and join me. Please come and join me. Sit wherever you want. Sorry? Viva Donald Woods, yes. Please sit with us. All the speakers, Lydia, Lee. Thank you very much. These were so many different aspects of anger, and I was thinking, who's missing from this panel? Well, of course, as usual, I'm totally partisan. I wish I had somebody from the other side with other types of anger. And then I was thinking, I wouldn't mind having a cop here, but we don't have them, so we'll channel them somehow. Do you want to be the cop, Lydia? No.
I have a very unique relationship with the
Use the
police.
mic.
No, I don't think I need it. Actually,
all right.
I have a very unique relationship with the police. I have been antagonizing them since I'm 14 years old. I've photographed cops in all kinds of compromising positions. I went to the World Police and Fire Games, 10,000 cops and firemen in Olympics.
I had no idea that I was picking exactly.
Making a mockumentary. My whole point of infiltrating the police force, and by the way, I have more gun training than the police force, and I love to rub their noses in
Okay,
that.
then I have invited also the other side.
Exactly. It is that, first of all, it's one of the worst jobs on the planet. You have to be an idiot if you want to become a police.
You know, Pasolini used to say that they were the true proletarians.
I mean, it is a job that you will never win at. There will always be more to be done that you cannot correct. It's so underpaid. It's absolutely ridiculous, and I love that they're taught to say they became a cop to help people. I don't
So
remember
are you
the
angry?
last time one
Are you
helped
angry
them,
at
but
the
anyway,
cops?
no, I'm not going to play the cop. I'll play the
Okay. No,
cop
no,
killer.
that's good.
Thank you very much.
So I wanted to ask Andrew, and also Lee, but especially Andrew, are we so easy to manipulate? Is it so easy to stoke anger?
Yes.
Yes.
So,
yeah, because if you have infiltrated them, you've also like felt the vibe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things about the sort of online misinformation sphere is that not everything has to be believed literally in order to be effective. There are ways that misinformation and hate speech can have sort of echoes that aren't just persuasion. It can be voter suppression. It can be kind of tilting the national narrative a little bit this way or that way. It can be getting people to respond to things. A lot of what journalists are now talking about is strategic silence, sort of like blacking out the names that you did, but there's many species of that. And one of them is not taking the bait when there is something viral happening in order to respond to it by correcting it, because correcting it often just inflames it. So yeah, it's very easy to manipulate. I guess one of the things that I wasn't able to get to in this very short version is that a lot of the people, the reason I felt it was important to spend so much time with them is that they're not kind of, the people who are leading these propaganda efforts are not in the throes of these things. There are followers who are in the throes of them, and I deal with them too, and how you get radicalized.
So they're quite cold and knowledgeable of
They're
what
manipulators. They're really meta media manipulators. And the forefront, the John the Baptist of this movement was Andrew Breitbart, who said politics is downstream from culture. And now that culture is all online and it's being conditioned through these algorithms that are meant to stoke outrage, and where the virality, I mean, there's always been sensationalism, there's always been polarized news, but it now feeds on itself in a feedback loop where the more viral it is, the more people see it, and the more people are sharing it, the more feeds it goes into. So these people are very good at doing what they do.
So it would be, Shaun, I was thinking, what is the antidote? What is the diffuser of that kind of anger? You know, from what you were saying before, it seemed to me it's respect, right? Because so much of the fear that you were, would respect work?
I think that would be really difficult to request from anyone, particularly if they feel threatened. So I think, as a foundation to what I'm about to say, the power that underlies anger is not all equal. So when we think about angry expression from, let's say, the NYPD, they are sanctioned by the state. So power lives in that entity very differently than, say, a young person navigating the streets that is strapped. So it was in this process of Primitive Games, the project that I shared with you, that I found familiarity, if not respect, to be the destabilizing power.
Destabilizing, okay, not diffusing, but destabilizing.
And so what would it look like to identify fear in a body that you would otherwise only see as enemy? That becomes a very different starting point. Mm-hmm. And again, is the very thing, that familiarity, that sense of humanity is the very thing that erases fear momentarily. Mm-hmm.
So Martha Nussbaum recently published about anger, and she discussed the fact, in her opinion, anger should be completely taken out of the political discourse because it's incoherent and it is always defeating of the purpose. Others instead argue that politics is also about conflict, so anger should be there and conflict should be there. I don't know, Marilyn, you were talking about a different kind of anger. What do you think about a statement
I
like
think
this?
Somebody said,
Yeah, don't worry, you keep on talking and then it turns on.
Turns on? Okay, I hear you.
Magic.
I was just thinking about everything that I heard tonight. It was brilliant. And I like the one person that said we have to control our anger. We have to be in charge of it. And I sort of believe that to be true. And the one thing I've seen just from collecting all this information is radical empathy seems to be the only thing I know about that breaks this impasse. It was an article in New York Magazine, and there was a gun violent victim and an NRA person, and they told each other their stories, and by the end they were both crying. And both, and then they told the story, and then the other person had to repeat their story. Mm-hmm. And it was like, how can we do that on a mass scale? Because the nuances are just erased. Yeah.
Well, I should say, because I left this one on a kind of bummer note, but there are people who I encountered who were able to come out of this kind of brainwashing thing, and it is through those kind of connections of, I met someone who, right as they were coming out of like a pretty hardcore Nazi radicalization, we spent many hours together. And
that guy in Florida?
Right, exactly. So there are ways that you can do it. It's really hard, but yes, I agree with you.
And Lee, you're dealing with a lot of moral outrage, but also you're dealing with the anger that created the conditions for some people to be morally outraged. And I am wondering, have you ever found a way to diffuse that anger, or there's no rationality that's possible, right?
I think to some extent there is. I would give up if I didn't think there was ever any way to reach people. I think after 9/11, I just bring that up because it was sort of the two, I think, biggest moment, the Trump administration after 9/11, when the public was most engaged. After 9/11 was tricky because that was classic fear, and it was very difficult to get through to people. They just didn't want to hear anything. I think right now with immigration, there are ways to get through to people, but it is fear on their part and anger, and I think that's what the administration is constantly pushing, is you should be fearful of these black and brown people in what they view as an invasion. But I agree, it ultimately comes down to trying to not have people be the other and to humanize. I think if you can't humanize the population you're trying to help, then it's impossible, because I can be out there talking about abstract constitutional principles and it just goes in one ear. It's never going to convince anybody. You have to make them think about the people who are subject to the victims as human beings, and I think that's the only way to do it, but that's hard, and because especially just sort of at a level of the bully pulpit, the president could reach 20 million people very easily and say, well, all these people are invading the country and they're all gangbangers and this and that. And for us to get our message out and say, well, think about the immigrants think about the immigrants who are parents in your school, who work with you, to get that message out and make people stop and think is difficult. It's possible, but it's difficult.
So, the Democrats have been accused of not understanding the anger on the other side.
Right.
So, and that could also be important.
Right, and I think, that goes to sort of, I think, the question about whether anger is a good motivator, but not ultimately that useful in persuading people, that if you just keep screaming, and I don't know, at some point to try and, that for me, it's critical that I try and understand where the other side is coming from when I go into court, because then I know I have no chance of persuading a judge. But it may be different if you're rallying people in the street. So I think it plays out differently.
Please.
Yeah, I want to say a few things, because I think race plays a really big factor in terms of how anger is expressed and how it's looked at, and gender as well. And one of the things that I have issue with is when white people say, determine the ways that black people should express anger. like what's the right way, you know?
That's perfect, because I had that question.
Yeah,
about,
you know, and I think that it's up to people to kind of decide for themselves what's useful. And then there was something else that I wanted to say about anger. But okay, so I'm thinking about that. And then I'm also thinking about, what is it, Hannah Gatsby and Nanette? Or is it, yeah, and you know, and it's a show, and I didn't like it so much in the beginning, but towards the middle, she started talking about like the view of women in the art world, and basically, I mean, it was outrageous.
I don't know if you know it. It's a comedy show, and it's pretty great.
Right,
Yeah.
and she was outraged, and I thought, wow, you know, a black woman would never, ever, ever have been able to do that show, right? Because we can't express rage in that way, you know. So I think it's really important. And then, you know, I was also thinking about like the sort of like the Dana Schutz controversy, and like you know, the entire world sort of like came out to admonish black protesters about, you know, how they express their anger. And I just thought it was interesting that like the whole dialogue, no matter who it was from, black, white, what class, they all, you know, were protecting the freedom of this white artist, and you know, making sure that she had freedom of speech. And then there was all this admonishment of black protest, and I thought that was really problematic, that no one really examined that.
There's a lot of, and there's a lot of process too. As you were speaking, I was thinking of the Guerrilla Girls. Could they be any color?
Yeah, they are every color. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
No, I would like to open up to the audience, because there's a lot of people that have questions, and I have questions for some of them. So let me start taking a few from you. And if you don't, I'm gonna, okay, let's start with the lady with the turban over here. Do we have a mic? It's coming from the other side. It's okay, it's coming. Yeah. Oh, no, it's coming to you.
We can't see anyone, by the way.
Yeah, of course.
Just so you know.
Okay, great.
Hi.
Thank you.
I'll stick with one question. Okay.
Yes.
I believe my question is for Marilyn and
Pamela?
No, Lucy.
Shaun?
No.
Lee?
Right next to me.
Lydia.
Lydia, sorry.
Okay.
I wanted to call you Lucia for some reason.
Lucia, nice. You are Italian after all.
So there's a way in which the two of you, your presentations here today stuck out for me from the others. And I'm wondering if both of you could tell me if you feel outside of power structures where there might be a real ability to make change.
Absolutely.
Because the other four people are sort of talking about through their work.
Okay, thank you. No,
I
the question's
understand.
clear.
I'm outside of everything. I've always felt, even though I've worked in different communities, movements, art forms, genres, I've always felt outside of everything, and I've always felt just like the town crier. I don't work in any kind of system. I don't feel that even after 42 years of bullhorning, which is what I do, that ultimately I can make much of a difference other than in an individual's life, because I will be the scream for them. But I don't feel that I can actually make any difference in the world. I don't think I have any cultural significance on that front whatsoever. I'm merely the town crier. You know, reality and the truth, especially when you've been talking about war, since under Ronald Reagan, it's not really a popular commodity. And you almost get sick of your own voice, but I can't stop talking about it. And therefore I took to other methods of creating with it through photography. But I am outside of all systems. That I'm here is merely because there's some perverse people around here that thought it might be amusing.
Thank God for perverse people. Yeah, I've definitely always
So
felt
perverse, yes.
outside of the system. But as an artist, I feel that my job is really to make a picture of the times we live in. And that's not an illustration, it's a metaphor. So
I just didn't get to finish the second part.
No. There's like, look at this, hundreds of people.
Well, the question,
Okay, who has questions?
The question wasn't, do you feel outside? The question was, do you understand that you are not? And in what ways have you encountered the institution? That was actually the question.
Well, I have yet to be institutionalized, but that could be any day now. So.
I mean,
I'll stay on this side of it.
Well, I'm 71. This is my first time at MoMA.
Oh, come on, it's not. It's not.
Yes, it is.
It's ridiculous.
No,
you're in the collection.
Barely.
Oh. Well, you're in my collection. Okay, lady over here.
Ooh, the mic is working. I mean, I probably maybe inappropriately, but want to do a second part just because we have you on stage. Specifically as a white woman, curious, because you are white women in power. You are on a stage at MoMA. As white women, do you see a place that you have privilege because you do obviously have a platform if you're here?
Of course.
Just to white women?
No, well, if the question was to Lydia and Marilyn, but please bring that up.
Yeah.
I understood that as a question about privilege.
Don't let the color of my skin confuse you.
Basically, I understood that to be a question that was about privilege that maybe I'm reading into more than it was. So I just wanted to.
Well, if you live in America,
stamp that
you've got
and if anyone else
privilege.
has
I can't hear you.
a question about
If
it.
you live in America, you've got immediate privilege.
I have a question because I'm glad that somebody brought up how the deal about the need to humanize Democrats accused of not understanding the anger on the other side. And I really think that is so bananas because, for 4 years, NPR has been doing specials on the Trump voter, and nobody at Fox is talking about the Hillary voter. Nobody at the New York Times talked about the Hillary voter. That there's this weird thing about us trying to supposedly that the Democrats don't really understand the other side, but in fact,
do you have a question? Sorry, because it's about questions. Yeah.
It is a bad question.
Yes, no, it is about question, not a bad question.
But it's a bad question.
Yeah.
The question is, why does this myth go on?
Okay. Mm-hmm. Who wants to take it? Andrew, you're the journalist.
Yeah.
So I just you're the pundit.
Yeah, I don't do well with why doesn't the New York Times cover X, Y, or Z because you can just find a link where they did. But I mean, and trust me, I would venture to say I watch more Fox News than anyone in the room. They talk about the left a lot. They don't talk about the left in a flattering way. So I don't think, but I take your point. I think the question of empathy is a really tricky one. What Marilyn said, I think, was radical empathy. So there's empathy that is a cheap gesture, that is just, oh, look, we went to this town in West Virginia and people are experiencing economic anxiety and we don't mention the word racism, we don't mention the word class, we don't mention the history of the country, blah, blah, blah. That's cheap pretense of empathy. I think radical empathy is something totally different. So I think, to your point, how many column inches you spend on this or that subject is not the issue. The issue is how you do it, and are you doing it intelligently and in a contextual way.
Okay, there's the green shirt, and then we'll get to, well, I'll pass. Okay, great. Yes.
My question is, I guess, for Lee and Andrew mostly, but also for everybody, what is the relationship between using the tools that are effective to channel anger and righteousness? So Andrew talked about examples where social media algorithms are utilized to fuel virality for bad lots of times. And right after that, Lee came up and talked about how can the ACLU mobilize more people. And my immediate thought is, why doesn't the ACLU use some of the methods that of manipulating social media for good?
Yeah, Lee, why
using
don't you?
some little bad stuff like clickbait, but for good. Is that something that's on the table? Is it okay?
I think we do try. I mean, we use social media. I don't know that I'm going to tell our comms team back at the ACLU that that people aren't hearing. No, I mean, I think we do it, but I think one of the things, and I think Andrew can speak to this better, is we're all just speaking to our own people. So a lot of the social media that we put out, it reaches millions of people, but it may be people already interested in what we, and I think we're not clicking on necessarily the people Andrew's covering, but they're reaching in. So I think we all are. But the question is sort of, I think for us is, that middle ground, how do we reach them? But we are, using a lot of, maybe not in the exact same way, but we try and, hit our
about
people
time,
with,
though.
right.
You should.
Well, there are also questions of what boundaries people are or aren't willing to cross personally. And there's a little part in my book where one of these guys that I was sitting with in their living room sort of turns to me in between interview segments and says, like, I could help you boost all your Twitter stats and stuff. Like, I can tell you what to do. And I was like, I think I'm good. Because I didn't think he was wrong. I just didn't want that to be my life. So there are things you could do to show crying babies, and you will hit people at emotional flashpoints. It's a question of how much that fits with the kind of dignified role you want to have in society.
Yeah, and
enough with this dignity.
Well, yeah, I don't think it's, a matter, like, we want to get stories out about young kids. And so it's not a matter that, and we have professional people who know how to do it. Where I thought Andrew was going is maybe just sort of the line you don't want, it's not the line you don't want to cross. We will not want to put out false information just because we know people will click through it or some kind of sensational thing that's not true. So I think for us, those are the boundaries where I think there are people on the other side who maybe, as Andrew was saying, when they were playing around with how to get the most hits, that's not what we're going to do. It's within boundaries. And so I think that's a limiting principle, but it's not a matter of we don't want to use social media. We don't want to get the stories of these children being ripped from their parents out there.
Thank you. Next one.
The beginning of the program was very provocative because it began with this the biological aspects of anger, and we didn't. Lydia, you mentioned once shame, and I'm just trying to, in thinking about today's program, it's like the link between individual anger to collective anger. We're talking a lot about collective anger, but we have so much of a cultural construct about shame and anger. And I wonder if any of the panelists could talk about, forgive me, I'm not sure how to formulate the question, not that there should be...
No, I think it's clear.
Yeah.
I think it's the relationship between shame and anger.
Well, I think that, for people of color, for women of color, like we're taught not to express anger, that we're too aggressive, that we're not entitled to it. So I don't necessarily think it's shame. It's more just kind of like conditioned out of it. But I'm interested in shame and anger.
I mean, a lot of my friends, I've had to read articles on it because I've never felt shame, humiliation. I've never felt insulted. I've never felt jealous. I'm sort of like a fembot. It's not that I don't have feelings. I have very strong feelings. I have, feelings of empathy, which is why I do what I do, and compassion. But I call these cancer-causing emotions, I don't have them. So I can't speak. I'm not doing angry performances out of shame or fear. I'm doing it because they have to be said by somebody. But I think that shame is one of the biggest curses on the American population because it is fearful. It does prevent people. It prevents them from being what they can be because it's such an inward thing. I wanted to mention too that you were talking about disgust, and disgust is the tool that propaganda uses because disgust, you were speaking about how emotions live in the body, trauma lives in the body, fear lives in the body, and disgust lives in the body, and it's why they use it in propaganda a lot. So that, once you've been polluted by disgust, it's hard to, even if you're intelligent, to work your way out of that kind of prejudice.
Shame and disgust, they're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
And guilt is when you do something wrong and someone makes you feel guilty, and then you can rectify it. But shame is you're wrong. Your very existence is disgusting.
It's put upon you. It's an emotion that's put upon you usually as a child.
And you're more likely to feel shame if you can't be angry.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, Shaun.
I would suggest that, I started my talk by saying that angry is an easier expression. shame is much harder physiologically and emotionally to engage because it requires more work. To be angry allows one to disengage from that core shame, particularly if it's coupled with some sense of guilt. I think what's important to place out into the room is that when it's translated into angry, it's more acceptable amongst white males as a valid expression. When any other demographic uses that translation, it becomes a problem.
Yeah, exactly. Very good point.
Next, Susan, a scarf over there. Thank you.
Thank you all. I was struck, Andrew, when you said that the negative emotions are the easiest to arouse. Is that correct? I mean, I don't want to list them all. And then I heard Lee say he was sort of in a quandary as to whether to play on compassion or fury. And my question is, does compassion have less power than anger because it's not as loud?
What, can you have both?
No, but I mean, it was really, you have two strategies there. One is, Lee's going, maybe I should use more compassionate images. I'm thinking of that thing that was viral, I think, on Facebook, where they had the Holy Family in cages.
Right.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Nativity scene.
Yeah, right, the nativity scene, right. But then it seems like we're lost if negative emotions are the closest to the surface and the easiest to galvanize. Yeah. So what's your position, having heard Lee's dilemma? I guess that's the answer. Or what, collectively, what do you think? Should we try for compassion or just stay with anger?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think partly it gets back to the question over here of which lines do you want to cross, or is it all about racking up the biggest numbers on a particular post, or do you want to try to have a better design strategy? And ultimately, for me, the question is, can there be a kind of movement to incentivize, non-financially incentivize, the companies to shift the algorithms so that the balance is shifted? Obviously, both of the things work. It's a question of proportion. And the proportions, I think, have to be shifted centrally or it's going to be a losing game.
Mm-hmm.
But can I complicate things? Wouldn't you suggest that it is inherently a failure of the platform? Yeah. Because there's no need to exist in physical space with the other individual. Mm-hmm. And so inevitably that is going to enable anger as an externalized expression, because you can do so in complete anonymity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I have a question. Is it anger that is mobilized, or is it shock? Because I feel like what happens, with the Trump administration and a lot of people is like we're being shocked, constantly being shocked, constantly having our buttons pushed, right? And so getting reactions from that, right? So I don't even label it as anger. It's just sort of like reactions and creating reaction. So I wouldn't say anger or compassion. I don't think those two things. Yeah. I think it's more about shock, and I think it's more about button pushing.
Well, right. I mean, literal, but it's literal button pushing too, right. Because the other thing that the reason these algorithms are doing this way is because there's a failure to be able to measure certain things as opposed to other things. All they can measure is, did you click, did you like, did you share, did you scroll? So it's literal button pushing. There are lots of emotions that computerized images can make you feel, but they're not measurable by these algorithms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, but I think, I think we're talking about a lot of different things here. I mean, one is, and I agree with the shock value, and then how to have the most, people responding to a tweet or something like that. But those are sort of, you compile a lot of numbers, and those are initial responses. But for us, we need people to go beyond just clicking one time, right? So if people are angry at the Trump administration, do they then say, we're going to come and help you? Or they can't get that child out of their mind, and so tell us how to volunteer because I can't bear to think of that child without his glasses. And so that's one of the things that we have to deal with, is not just because, as Andrew said, there are a lot of experts who can tell you how to get your clicks up, right? I mean, that's easy. And the anger thing works quickly on that, and the shock value works quickly. But to get people to go out there and do something, then that I think is a more complicated question. That's what, for me, I was raising.
I would like to end by asking questions to two groups of people that are here. We have some people here from the Lausanne Collective, and then we have two people here that were in Beirut for the resistance lately. So I would like to ask you both. Can I steal your? No, thank you. Thank you. Oh yeah, I can get two of them. So can I ask you? Do you think that the anger in Hong Kong and in Beirut will have long-lasting effects, and will be a propeller for progress ultimately? Do you feel comfortable, or should? Yeah. Please.
Answer.
Well, it's a collective.
A bunch of people are here.
Yeah.
Oh dear, that's not the point of a collective. But one could say that the current iteration of the protests are the manifestation of an anger that has been boiling for about the last 30 years. Like it's been elided, and I think we sort of mentioned it in our video a little, which is that the economic pressures are always there. The fact that we were colonized and the same colonial structures are still there, even though we are no longer colonized by the British, it's still there. All of the economic pressures, all of that, of the exploitation and the lack of actual political representation has motivated decades of protests. There has been a major mobilization every year on July 1st.
And do you think that this latest representation or expression of anger will have some effect?
Insofar as protests continue, sure. Will it have political? Will there be some way out of this political impasse? Maybe. I don't know what we think.
But I think also that, that question kind of sometimes misses the point. I think sometimes the anger is the point. Yeah. And the fact that it interrupts our daily lives and it forces us to stop and think, hey, maybe something's not right. Maybe I'm unhappy at whatever it is. And in
Our
Hong Kong,
friends
it happens
from Beirut are nodding. So
it happens to be a response that is in itself, even if it doesn't come to the outcome that we want, which unfortunately is possible. The interruption is the point.
Thank you. Beirut.
Actually, this is a very good point to kind of, link it with Beirut, where the discussion about anger has been a very direct one as well. So there has been a lot of criticism of the angry/violent aspects of the first few days of protest in the, not just, I say Beirut, but I mean Lebanon in general, not just the capital. And where there has been a lot of criticism by saying, no, our revolution is a peaceful one, our revolution is a polite one. But that's almost like it's an oxymoron of some sort, because as you've said now, there's an accumulation of anger that spans probably if we're not going to go until from the kind of origin of the country, at least the last few decades, the last 30-40 years, where people's economic situation has just been extremely unacceptable to anybody, not only in this theater, but probably in this country. And so in that sense, the anger has been, and kind of countering that narrative of no, we need to control our anger, we need to control our violence, has been a propeller for the kind of sustenance of the movement as well.
And I think this is a very... Oh, you want to say something, Aya?
Just, I agree with everything Alice said. I think your question, will this anger lead to sustained change in Lebanon? I believe unequivocally yes.
Great.
I think that in Lebanon we have had the phenomenon that was talked about during the Trump administration that I think maybe Lee mentioned, that there is a little bit of apathy, or I think Pamela said the threshold for pain has been increased. We have in Lebanon lived with an increased threshold of pain and humiliation for 30 years, and somehow it snapped. And in part, I believe that the role of women in the revolution has enabled this snapping because women have taken control of their voice and their anger, and they are not ashamed to be angry. And men have somehow found refuge behind the women because they represent a more conciliatory approach and a less violent approach. And I think that for the first time, we're seeing this apathy turn into action through these two kind of phenomenons happening. So, yeah.
And I think this is kind of a lesson because we've been talking about accumulated anger from many different viewpoints here. And it's been quite an amazing evening, I have to say. And I want to close it with a quote from Audre Lorde. What can you say? And she says that anger is loaded with information and energy. So it's very true. And we've learned about many different types of anger tonight. We can keep on talking about it because, as you know, outside there's mediocre wine and so-so snacks. And Andrew will be signing books, and Lydia will be signing. I didn't ask you if you wanted to sign them, but there are your books too. We couldn't bring everybody's books. But I would love it if you did. I just wanted to ask you permission first. But yeah, we don't have everybody's books here, but they are great books, so you should get everybody. Pamela, do you want to say something else?
Yeah, Sweet Dreams is available online through
Belladonna.
Belladonna.
Yes.
And I have a book coming out next year,
Yay.
September 2020, with City Lights.
Great, City
Poetry
Lights.
Prose.
Thank you for being here tonight. And thank you, Fernand and Sam. Thank you. I know that you have to run, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. 'Cause